On this episode of What the Ship, we look at the maritime stories and events shaping global shipping for the week of April 27th, 2025. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. I am really beginning to think about change the name of the series from What the Ship to What the... It's another four-letter word. I won't say it here because I don't want to get YouTube mad at me. But when we're talking about global shipping, what the... Seriously, is there's another word that comes to mind here. There is a lot of ship happening around the planet. I mean, the amount of stories I can give you today is dozens, not just 5. But we're going to have to limit ourselves because I do have a full-time job I have to cover too. End of the semester, final grades are due next week, so got to get grading here. So we're going to do an abbreviated 5 stories here. We're going to use Lloyd's List this week to kind of highlight our 5 stories. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. So first, we're dealing with the sanctioned fleet. This is what's known as the shadow fleet, the ghost fleet, the parallel fleet, the dark fleet, whatever you want to call it. But there is a growing number of ships that are sailing on the high seas that are under some sort of sanction. It began with Venezuela and Iran, and it morphed into Russia with their invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. These sanctions are being leveled by the G7, by the EU, by a lot of the quote-unquote developed nations of the world. But what we're seeing and what Lloyd's List talks about in this story is that 36% of the vessels sanctioned in 2025, again, we're only into April here, have already reflagged. The average time to go from the first flag change post-sanctions has dropped from 85 days to 45 days. And the two of the most common flags being used right now is Comoros and Guyana. And to give you an idea of the scope and scale of this, let's go over to our buddies at Marine Traffic. So this image cleaned up here shows you all the registered flags for the nation of Comoros. If you don't know where Comoros is, it's in Africa. Specifically, it's an island off the southeastern coast of Africa between Africa and Madagascar right down here. But here you see all the flagged vessels of Comoros. Notice most of the ships you see there are red. That signifies tankers. And you can see them speckled about up here in the Arctic and Baltic, meaning they're carrying probably carrying Russian fuel, coming through the Med, through the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandeb, out into the Gulf of Aden, cheers, and up here along the coast of Asia. Shift over to the Guyana's registry, and again, you see that Guyana on the northern coast of South America, so you'll see some vessels up here in and around Guyana, but most of the vessels you see here are hauling oil out of the Persian Gulf and over to China. So not unusual to have open registries, what were sometimes called flags of convenience, FOCs. So it doesn't matter if a ship is flying a Comoros or a Guyana flag. We have seen basically ships fly flags from nations like Mongolia, Switzerland. The reason is this: ships are engaged in international trade, and under the International Maritime Organization, which is the UN shipping arm, ships have to be registered. But more importantly, countries have the right to inspect vessels coming into their ports under what's called port state control. And it is the flag nation, the nation whose flag is flying from a ship's responsibility to ensure that these ships are meeting the minimum requirements set by the IMO for safety of life at sea, for pollution, for manning, for crewing, for all those regulations. And the issue we're seeing here is that's not being done. We just had a case where Estonia stopped a ship flying the flag of Djibouti, and that ship was not registered in Djibouti. It had dropped its registry. So we have ships flying under false flags, not the false flags that most people tend. This is the original false flags. And some of these registries are not doing their due diligence in ensuring that ships are meeting the standards. And what is happening now is a lot of ships are jumping registries to avoid litigation and, more importantly, do what is necessary to ensure the ships are operating within the established rules on the international high seas. All right, let's go to story number 2. So story number 2, the EU is demanding insurance information in its waters. Pull over, show me your license and insurance. It sounds like the European Union is about to become the California Highway Patrol and demanding your proof of insurance. Now, I have to note that there is a problem with this. The notes here in the story: amendment designed to gather intelligence with states still following UNCLOS closely. India widens list of approved insurers to include U.S. sanctioned companies. Insurance sector was not briefed ahead of this announcement. So why is it you can't stop a vessel to see whether or not they have insurance? Well, The problem is, does a nation state like within the European Union have the right to demand insurance information from a vessel? Now, you'll note it says demand insurance information in its waters. You can't do this in international waters. International waters only goes out 12 miles from the coast. If you're outside of 12 miles, you're in international waters. You're in basically the Wild Wild West when it comes to rules and regulations. But along the coast of the EU, especially in the Baltic, especially in the Danish Straits, where ships do come within territorial waters, you have two specific articles of UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, that applies to this. First, you have Article 19, the meaning of innocent passage. Passage is innocent as so long as it is not prejudicial to the peace, good, order, or security of the coastal state. Such passage shall take place in conformity with this convention and with other rules of international laws. Passage of a foreign ship shall be considered to be prejudicial to the peace, good, order, or security of the coastal state in the territorial sea if it engages in any of the following activities. And it has a long list here of specific. Most of these are dealing with military or basically actions that infringe upon the coastal state. Actions, for example, regarding pollution are there, fishing, carrying of military weapons, practice with the weapons. But the catch-all there is the very last one, any other activity not having a direct bearing on this passage. That's kind of the open-end nature of UNCLOS. It allows you to kind of really say what you want. The problem with this is the Houthi are attacking vessels because they're arguing that Israel is perpetrating a genocide in Gaza, and therefore that gives the Houthi the right to attack ships, even ships that have nothing to do with Israel or Gaza. And they're saying that they can violate Article 19. Well, now you have the EU saying they can violate Article 19 because ships are sailing through their waters without insurance. When you look at UNCLOS, there's only one real mention of insurance in it. Article 235, responsibility and liability. States are responsible for the fulfillment of their international obligations concerning the protection, preservation of the marine environment. States shall ensure that recourse is available in accordance with their legal systems for prompt and adequate compensation. It goes on, and it's this third section that has the main issue, with the objective of assuring prompt and adequate compensation in respect of all damage caused by pollution of the marine environment. States shall cooperate in the implementation of existing international law and the further development of international law relating to responsibility and liability for the assessment and compensation for damage and the settlement of related disputes, as well as, where appropriate, development of the criteria and procedures for payment of adequate compensation, such as compulsory insurance or compensation funds. So, because of the threat of a marine environment damage from a container ship, or more likely a tanker, which is really where the focus is right now, is on tankers, you have to have the required insurance to pay for any damages. And what nation states are going to argue, particularly in the EU, is that under Article 235, if a ship does not have the necessary insurance to cover a hazard, which again, we've seen happening here with Russian vessels breaking up and causing oil spills, then under Article 19, that kind of caveat section there at the very end, then the EU can demand insurance information in its waters. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. All right, let's go to story number 3. Story number 3 could have been story number 1, could have been the only story we talked about here. No relief for Transpacific trade despite talk of lower China tariff. Trump says tariffs on China will come down substantially, but China maintains there are no trade talks underway. It will take time for fallout from the trade war to hit the U.S. store shelves because of the length of ocean transits and U.S. inventory levels. That is exactly true. It's going to take 4 to 6 weeks for this to really hit, and we had a lot of front loading. The first quarter of 2025 was heavy with traffic. The carriers continue to reduce Transpacific capacity, Ocean Alliance sees highest level of blank sailings, according to EC. I can't tell you the amount of information that's out there that is not 100% accurate. I literally, it's a full-time job on Twitter, on Bluesky, and a lot of things to counter this with people who have high visibility out there. They're saying things that are just not correct, including on major news organizations. So let's put some context here to all that we just said. First, let's go to the Port of Los Angeles. Port of Los Angeles is a good catch-all because Port of LA is the biggest port in the United States, along with Long Beach. They capture about 40% of all the cargo that comes into the United States, and understand about 40% of the containers imported into the United States come from China. So it's a good measure. You have heard that Port of LA is a standstill. I had somebody on YouTube and on TikTok sitting there saying the port of LA is deserted. It's not deserted. It's full of ships. I just looked at it on marine traffic. I can show it to you, but it's full. But let me show you the signal data. This is the weekly report put out by the port of LA. Here it is. So for the week 18, the week of April 27th to May 13th, we're expecting an import volume of 85,000 TEU. Those are 20-foot equivalent units, 20-foot containers. 17 vessels are scheduled in. That is 11.21% higher than the same time last year. Now, many of these cargoes coming in are ships that were loaded prior to April 9th. If they're coming in before April 9th, they're beating the tariff in. But then the following week, week 19, we're seeing that drop, 19.3% drop from last year. Now, I have to note something. Last year, 2024, is the second highest year in the history of LA imports. So when you're comparing to the second highest year of LA imports, still doing pretty good. 19.31 drop. Week 20, now these numbers are beginning to change a bit. We're seeing changes here. This was up as high as 30%, but now what we're seeing is 86,918 TEU, 18 vessels coming in. It's now a drop of 22%. It was 31% coming in. So we are starting to see a bit of a change here. What does that mean? I have no friggin' idea, because everyone took a pause from ordering goods. You're hearing stats like 30% of imports are, we're down 30% of imports. That is a week-to-week measurement. It's not 30% year-to-year. That's the important measurement here. They're talking about where we were last year at this time. Let's look at the port of the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which is the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. So this is the schedule coming in for Seattle. This is their 4-week vessel forecast. And this is the same for Tacoma. Talked to a buddy up in Seattle. One of the things he commented to me, I like firsthand perspectives. He's a dock worker there, works the cranes. He says, number one, ships coming into Seattle are lighter than they typically are, so not as much cargo coming in. He's also seeing the beginning of the slowdown. He's seeing a reduction in the number of ships. They're talking about closing the port 2 days a week versus just 1 day a week because of that cargo slowdown. When we talk about the blank sailings, this is the Drury report just out showing the data between week 18, which is 28 April, all the way to week 22, 1 June. Out of 718 scheduled sailings, this is on the main east-west trade lane. This is the Transpacific, the Transatlantic, and the Asia to Northern Europe and Med. We're seeing about a 10% cancellation rate across the boards. That is 75 sailings out of 718 scheduled sailings. The vast majority of them are on the Ocean Alliance, where we're seeing that 20% reduction, and the Premier Alliance, where we're seeing that reduction. These sailings are more focused, these blank sailings, these canceled sailings, are more prevalent on the Trans-Pacific route than on the other 3 routes. So you are seeing a bit of a higher number coming into the United States. So I think we got to be really careful with the numbers coming out. Talking to people, what we are seeing, and a lot of key stats coming out, for example, is we're seeing truck hauls coming out of LA down 15%. So that means the number of truck hauls, the number of short and long haul trucks coming out of LA are down. We're seeing bookings coming down. So everybody's expecting it. But probably the biggest data I saw that came in this week was the executive director of the Port of LA, Gene Soroka, came out and said, we can expect to see the Port of LA being week to week down 35% as long as the tariff war continues, or the trade war, whatever you want to call it. Somebody told me it's not a trade war. I don't know what the definition of a trade war is, but this is about as close you can get to a trade war as it is. But if this continues, you're going to see a 35% reduction in the number of containers coming into LA. Again, remember, 40% of all containers coming into the United States come from China. 40% of those containers go into the Port of LA, and he's talking about a 35% reduction. That reduction is going to be across all the ports, not just LA and Long Beach, but Seattle, Tacoma. We'll see it on the Gulf Coast coming into Houston. We'll see it on the East Coast coming into Savannah, New York, New Jersey, and all the secondary ports. It's going to be interesting to note, and I am watching this, do we see a volume uptick going into Vancouver, Prince Rupert, which is the West Coast Canadian ports? Do we see an uptick going into the Mexican ports? Even if we see those upticks, just to be clear, you cannot handle the volume that normally goes into LA and Long Beach in those ports. So we are definitely seeing this. We're seeing companies begin the layoffs. We're seeing companies slow down. Understand, if companies were operating by just-in-time logistics, in other words, they were flowing cargo in just as they needed it, then this is going to be a big impact. This is going to hurt them a lot. However, if they were able to store cargo, if they were able to front load and use the new kind of warehouse technology that's out there so that they can better position goods around the United States, then they'll be able to get through this for a few weeks, maybe until the tariffs come down and things settle out. The problem is there are certain commodities that have to flow week to week. You can't just stock them up in a warehouse because of either their manufacturing dates or they have a shelf life issue. And a lot of companies just can't afford to have goods in a warehouse somewhere because that incurs costs. So we're definitely going to see it. If you're seeing shortages now, that's because we're making those shortages. It's not because of the deliveries coming in. We're creating our own shortages because of panic buying, which is typically what happens. You will see this. If people start running for toilet paper, most toilet paper is made in the United States. You don't need to run for toilet paper. We cause a lot of this ourselves, but this is going to have an impact. The problem I see is this. You got to be careful about how you read the data. I'll give you another example. Last line here talks about the highest level of blank sailings according to EC. If you go to EC's website, their blog, this is a blog from January 31st of this year. This is showing the monthly trade lane data from Asia to the west coast of the United States. So here you see the number of liner services, basically how many ships are servicing this area. Now, this is as of January, in the January 2025. So these numbers here in 2025, the end months here, are basically estimates coming in. But if you go to this same time period in April and May of 2024, especially come here, if you look at the sailing schedule versus lost sailings or blank sailings, in April, 26 ships were blank sailed. We had 26 voyages that didn't happen. In May, it was 19, and in June, 22. So we do see blank sailings happen quite often. One of the things to be aware of is shipping companies will overbook their vessels and then cancel the sailings and then consolidate the loads onto ships to get the max cargo on board a ship. They would much rather sail one ship fully loaded than to sail two ships half loaded. It's economical. It's pure economy here. It's economy of scale. And so that creates some disruptions, as we see. When you look at the blank sailings that LA is forecasting, for example, that looks bad when you look at their numbers. But the question is, ships are also getting bigger. We're having much larger ships than before with the ship replacement schedule so that you can get better economy of scale on much larger ships. The Neo-Panamax ships up to 15,000 TEU that can go into the LA ports, for example, they'd much rather use those much larger ships than smaller 6,000 to 10,000 TEU box ships. So all I'm saying is you have to be very careful about the data that's out there and what people are saying. You got to kind of dig down into it to fully understand what is about to transpire. And if we get a resolution on the tariffs with the United States and China very quickly, which we've seen happen in other countries between President Trump and others, then we can have a reset. But the impact is still going to be there. We will see this impact no matter what come mid-May, late May into June, when these vessels are scheduled to arrive and the cargo is scheduled to be out into the distribution sites and into the retailers. So expect that to happen without a doubt. We're going to see an impact. But again, that's against a very big first quarter where we had record numbers. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our next story. Story 4 deals with the U.S. Trade Representatives, Section 301, and the port fees. Now, we've covered this quite a bit in some previous videos, and I'll have the link to them up above here so you can take a look at them. But this story from Lloyd's: most shipping lines can avoid the U.S. port fees, but Cosco, this is the Chinese overseas shipping company, not the big box store. Big box store has a T in it, Costco, not Costco, faces major challenge. The final USTR decision covers much smaller portion of the fleet than the draft version. It's much more targeted, giving carriers much more flexibility to redeploy tonnage and avoid U.S. port fees. In particular, one of the things it said was that the fees will not be cumulative. You will only incur the fee on the first U.S. port you hit in a voyage. Following these redeployments, you'll move, for example, Chinese-built vessels off the U.S. trade and put Korean or Japanese vessels on. Any remaining Chinese box ships calling the U.S. will have a harder time passing along costs via surcharges for competitive reasons. Finally, the port fees could lead to lower competition in U.S. liner trades, while scrapping could be constrained as older Japanese and Korean-built ships are kept in service. If you want the exact details beyond looking at my video, you can come over here to the USTR section. I'll have the link in the show notes where they talk about how they're going to phase in this. So for the first 180 days, there will be no fees at all. But after that, in the first phase, after 180 days, fees on vessel owners and operators of China-based on net tonnage per U.S. voyage increasing incrementally over the following years. So if you're a Chinese-based company, and that's largely Cosco, but there are some other smaller firms out there, CU Lines, SM Lines, they could potentially see this. Fees on operators of Chinese-built ships based on net tonnage or containers increasingly incrementally over the following years. I have to say, if you own a big Chinese container ship, that fee is not going to be huge. It's just not. It's not going to be a big. You're going to get maybe $100 on a box, depending on what you're shipping on the box. That's not going to materialize to be a big, huge fee. And then finally, the last one here, to incentivize U.S.-built car carrier vessels, fees on foreign-built car carrier vessels based on their capacity. This is an interesting one because it is going to impact some U.S. car-based carriers because they're using foreign ships. And then in the second phase, this takes place after 3 years, they're going to attempt to incentivize LNG, liquefied natural gas vessels, limiting restrictions on transporting LNG via foreign vessels. Basically what they have is a requirement in there, a percentage that has to be carried on U.S. vessels. And if that's not being met, there will be fines associated with that. So this entire USTR 301 shipbuilding issue was meant to impact China's maritime dominance. That's what it's all titled. So it's not surprising that Cosco, owned by the Chinese Communist Party, is going to be the one that faces the biggest challenges. It's kind of what it's intended to. So it's a news story, but it shouldn't be news to anybody because that was the intent here of it. Now, there's still some issues that need to be worked out on the U.S. trade rep. For example, there's no max fee, so there's some people running around saying that the fees are going to be higher than what was envisioned of $1 million, $1.5 million, with some people throwing out numbers of 8 to 10 million based on tonnage and container values. I think you have to go back. The USTR said that they're going to come out with more provisions for this. Remember, nothing's being enacted within 180 days, and we're going to need legislation to enact this. The USTR by themselves cannot enact this. All right, let's go ahead over to our last story. So last one deals with decarbonization and the International Maritime Organization. Actually, two stories. First, decarbonization now depends on one key detail. Defining which fuels qualify as green and which are rewarded will make all the difference. So what is counted as a green fuel? Is liquefied natural gas? Is green methanol? Is electricity? Is hydrogen? Is ammonia? What's going to be that new rule? And so the e-fuel outlooks is far from certain. Add to it, the 24 target is now the center of our universe, says Cargill decarbonization head. So aiming to hit decarbonization by 2050 and the new standards set by 2040 is really pushing global shipping to change over their propulsion methods and come up with new vessels, which means that vessels being built today in 2025 may have to be scrapped before 2040. Which means you're going to have to pay for new ships, and that is going to raise shipping costs. We keep talking about tariffs being leveled by the United States, but again, the IMO is leveling tariffs right now on carbon emissions. They're setting up green zones for ships to sail, and now they're setting benchmarks by which ships have to conform to certain levels. This is putting a massive global tariff on shipping. Second story there, IMO carbon price not a done deal, industry warns. Last-minute votes on adoption could derail the process. The United States withdrew from these meetings. They didn't withdraw from the IMO, but they just did not attend the most recent round. And for a couple of reasons, and I've talked about this with a few people, if the United States participated, they would have been one of 170 countries in there. By not participating, they make a bigger mark. By not attending, it makes news. However, they got to be careful because even if they do attend, which I think they should, I think you have to get in line these other nations. The problem is that the U.S. vote is the same as Comoros vote or Guyana. Actually, if you get Comoros and Guyana together, they outvote the United States. where do they want to vote? Because these open registries have a lot of sway, because the way voting is done in the IMO is like the UN. It's country to country. So the US has to build an alliance of nations to ensure that, this issue, which granted needs to be done. We need to make cleaner emissions from our vessels. However, the question is, how much should we pushing to decarbonize the largest structures ever built by humans versus, I don't know, planes, cars, trucks? There's other issues that are emitting carbon out there beyond just ships. And to make ships carbon neutral, to make them efficient, again, Sal has a solution. It's called a friggin' sailboat. But the problem is you can't get a 24,000 TEU sailboat. Yes, I know you can put the wind rotors on them and reduce your propulsion, but you can't create a fully sail container ship ultra large. Yes, you can make smaller ones. I know, I've seen the smaller ones, but you can't do a bigger one. And so the question is, how does this all play out? So 5 stories across the global spectrum. That is a lot of shipping right there. All of these are going to be playing a part, not just in this week's news coming forward, but in the weeks ahead. And that's one of the reasons why you should be subscribing to what's going on with shipping and make it the most popular maritime YouTube channel on the internet. The most popular is like, how many of them are there? There's not that many. There's me and a few others. There's just not a lot. I mean, because it's shipping. Who cares? But we try to make it interesting. We try to make it enjoyable for you. And if we do make it enjoyable for you, hey, how about supporting the channel? How do you do that? Well, many ways you can do it. Number 1, you can subscribe and like to the channel. Hit that bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. You can give it a big thumbs up. You can share it across social media. Call a friend. Hey, if every one of you gets someone else to subscribe to the channel, man, we double the entire volume of this channel. That'd be great. That'd be fantastic. Get us over 500,000 subscribers. Next big objective right now. Get over 500,000 subscribers. I didn't think I'd have 5,000 subscribers, and now we're talking about 500,000. That's crazy. Or you can support the page by hitting that super thanks button down below, where you can contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, the Sal, signing off.